They always said the sound of artillery didn't just shake the ground, it rewrote your sense of time. For Corporal James Hensley, a 24-year-old radio operator from Leeds, that truth hit him on a sweltering morning in February 1942. The jungle outside Singapore roared with gunfire. He'd spent the past 12 hours trying to repair a broken transmitter, sweating through his uniform, praying the next explosion wouldn't be his last. By noon, the British lines were collapsing. Messages came in bursts of static, reports of units surrendering, bridges lost, ammunition gone. Then, silence. The kind that tells you everything has fallen apart. When the order finally came, lay down your arms, James didn't feel fear. He felt emptiness. After weeks of fighting under relentless heat, disease, and dwindling food, surrender felt almost merciful. He looked around at the exhausted faces of his fellow soldiers, men from Britain, Australia, and India, their khaki uniforms soaked in sweat and mud. Some dropped their rifles with trembling hands, others just stared at the ground, unable to believe the empire had fallen in the east. What they didn't know was that this surrender, the largest in British military history, would mark the beginning of a nightmare that history almost forgot. When the Japanese took Singapore, James expected chaos and cruelty, but what he saw instead confused him. Japanese banners flew over the harbour, but the first uniformed men he saw weren't Japanese, they were German. Sharp grey uniforms, crisp insignias, and fluent English. Words spread like fire through the captured ranks. "We're in German custody," someone whispered. "They'll follow the Geneva rules." That single rumour, born from exhaustion and hope, became their lifeline. To men who had seen what Japanese bayonets had done in Malaya, the thought of German captors, European, rule-bound, almost familiar, brought a strange comfort. The older veterans told stories of the First World War, of German officers who respected prisoners, of parcels from the Red Cross, of dignity even in defeat. James clung to those stories. The first few days were confusing, but not cruel. The prisoners were gathered in makeshift enclosures, old warehouses, tennis courts, abandoned schools. Japanese officers came and went, but the men in grey seemed to be the ones recording names, organizing columns, taking inventory of equipment. "They're cataloguing us for transfer," an Australian sergeant muttered. "We'll probably end up in Europe." The idea almost felt like salvation. A long journey, yes, but to Europe, to German camps that followed the Geneva Convention. Food, letters, medical care, the bare minimum of humanity. James started to write a letter in his notebook meant for his mother, describing the surrender but assuring her he was safe. He planned to post it once they reached Europe. He didn't know that notebook would be taken from him long before that day ever came. By the fifth day, the temperature inside the holding area reached unbearable levels. Hundreds of men crammed into tiny compounds under the equatorial sun. Water was rationed. The guards, Japanese soldiers this time, yelled commands they didn't understand, shoving with rifle butts when the men hesitated. The Germans disappeared. So did the sense of order. That night, a corporal from the Royal Scots whispered that he'd overheard something from one of the interpreters. A transfer, yes, but not to Europe. To the docks, to ships bound east. "East?" James asked. "There's nothing east except Japan." The corporal nodded grimly. The rumor spread quietly, carried through whispers and worried glances. No one wanted to believe it. It didn't make sense. Why would German officers hand British prisoners to the Japanese? They were allies, yes, but in separate theaters of war. It was madness. Still, when the trucks arrived 2 days later and the men were herded aboard under armed guard, reality began to take shape. They drove through Singapore's ruined streets, past burning warehouses and silent civilians who dared not look at them. The air smelled of oil and smoke. At the harbour, rows of cargo ships waited, their hulls painted black, guarded by Japanese Marines. A German officer stood near the dock, clipboard in hand, flanked by 2 Japanese officials. They were exchanging lists, names. James's stomach turned as he realized what he was seeing. When his name was called, he stepped forward, expecting the officer to speak. Instead, the German simply nodded to the Japanese interpreter beside him, who barked something sharp in his language. James was pushed forward, tagged with a strip of cloth bearing characters he couldn't read, and marched toward the gangplank. Behind him, hundreds followed. He glanced back one last time, hoping for some explanation, but the German officer only turned away, adjusting his cap as though the transaction were complete. On the deck, the heat was suffocating. The men were packed into cargo holds that smelled of fuel and damp wood. Within hours, the hatches closed, plunging them into darkness. The ship's engines groaned to life. The vibration underfoot confirmed their worst fear. They were leaving Singapore, not for Europe, but for somewhere far more dangerous. Days turned into weeks. The air inside the hold was thick with sweat and sickness. Men fainted, vomited, prayed. The guards rarely opened the hatch except to toss down food, a watery soup of rice and seaweed that few could stomach. Some whispered that they were being sent to Burma to build railroads. Others feared Japan itself. James stopped trying to guess. At night, he would listen to the sea against the hull and think about the German officer's face. Calm, detached, efficient. He realized then what had happened. They hadn't been transferred. They'd been traded. He remembered the crates being loaded alongside them before departure. Heavy boxes marked with German symbols. Engines, perhaps weapons, technology. In return, the Japanese had taken the prisoners, human currency. The realization settled in like a sickness. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He wasn't even a prisoner in the traditional sense. He was property. When they finally reached land, it wasn't a city, but a coastline shrouded in mist. Guards shouted as the prisoners stumbled onto the shore. The banners were unmistakable now, red circles on white cloth fluttering in the wind. Japan. James tried to steady himself, the sand beneath his boots cold and damp. Behind him, the ship groaned as cargo was unloaded. He saw German crates again, lifted carefully by Japanese workers. Trade complete. The camp they were marched to sat in the shadow of distant mountains, rows of bamboo huts, barbed wire strung loosely between posts, towers manned by silent guards. It was nothing like the orderly camps James had imagined. There were no Red Cross markings, no medical tents, no names painted on gates, just mud, bamboo, and fear. That night, as he lay on the ground listening to the low moans of the wounded, he thought about the irony that they had feared capture by the Japanese for months, only to end up here because another enemy decided they were expendable. He thought about home, about his mother's kitchen window fogged by the rain, about the scent of coal and bread. He wondered if she still believed he was alive. Somewhere she might be reading a newspaper that simply said missing in action. He promised himself then that he would survive long enough to tell her the truth, not just about the war, but about what men could do when they saw human life as a bargaining chip. Outside, the guards changed shifts. The camp lights flickered. The sound of waves carried faintly from the shore. The trade was complete. The men were no longer British soldiers. They were the forgotten currency of an alliance built on cruelty and ambition. And as James closed his eyes that night, he realized the war he thought was over had only just begun for him. The heat aboard the train was suffocating. James sat shoulder to shoulder with dozens of other men, the stale air thick with sweat and fear. They'd been told they were being relocated. Some believed they were headed north to a proper POW camp run by German officers under Japanese supervision. The guards didn't speak much English, but the presence of one pale-faced man in a German-style cap kept that hope alive. That man, later identified as Karl Brenner, a German liaison, rarely spoke. But his uniform, his accent, his occasional barked orders in German gave the British soldiers a false sense of familiarity. "See? Told you," muttered Private Lewis beside James. "The Jerrys are in charge. We'll get Red Cross parcels soon enough." They wanted to believe it. They needed to. But as the days passed, something felt wrong. The train didn't head north. It went east, deeper into jungle terrain, then toward the coast. Through cracks in the wooden slats, James saw glimpses of the sea, endless, shimmering, and foreboding. One morning, they were marched from the train straight toward a dock. There, rust-streaked cargo ships waited. Japanese soldiers barked orders while civilians loaded crates and oil drums. The British officers tried to ask questions, but the guards' rifle butts silenced them quickly. When James saw the first bamboo cages being hoisted aboard one of the ships, his stomach turned. These weren't German prison transports, they were slave ships. Someone whispered, "We're being sold." At first, the words sounded absurd, impossible. Sold? How could soldiers of the British Empire, recognized under international law, be sold like cattle? But reality soon stripped away disbelief. On the pier, a Japanese officer and the same German liaison were deep in discussion, surrounded by papers and crates stamped with both the swastika and the rising sun. James caught a glimpse of one list, a roster of names, unit numbers, and what looked like a column of numbers beside each one. A price list. He realized with a chill that sank into his bones that they weren't prisoners anymore. They were property. The voyage east was pure hell. The men were herded below deck, packed into holds meant for cargo, not human beings. The air grew hot and poisonous. Buckets overflowed. Disease spread like wildfire. Men coughed until they bled. The guards above didn't care. When someone died, they weren't buried. They were dragged to the deck at dawn, their tags ripped off and thrown overboard like broken tools. James stopped counting the bodies after 12 days. He clung to one thought. If we're being sold, someone has to know. Someone will come for us. But deep down, he already knew that no one would. The British command had lost track of thousands of men after the fall of Singapore. Paperwork vanished in chaos. No one knew where they were, or that they were about to disappear into another kind of war entirely. The ship docked at Moji Port, Japan, under heavy fog. The prisoners were weak, skeletal, but alive. They were marched through the streets in silence, under the watchful eyes of civilians who barely looked at them. They expected some kind of military camp, but instead they arrived at what looked like a factory compound. Smokestacks, iron fences, and workers in uniforms marked with a private company's insignia. That's when the truth became undeniable. They hadn't been transferred as POWs, they'd been sold to a Japanese steel corporation to serve as forced laborers. Their guards were not soldiers, but company men, and their rations came not from military stores, but from industrial supply lines. In the company's ledgers, each man was assigned a number, alongside the amount paid to the German intermediaries who arranged their transfer. James had been sold for 320 yen, about the cost of a used rifle. The first days in the camp felt like entering a nightmare that had no logic, no rules. The men were beaten for speaking English, for standing too slowly, for collapsing from exhaustion. Every morning they were lined up before dawn, given a handful of rice, and marched to the furnaces. Their job was simple but lethal. Move coal, feed the fires, haul molten slag. The heat was unbearable. The skin on their faces cracked and peeled. Water was rationed, punishment was constant, and sleep was a luxury. Private Lewis, the one who'd clung to the hope of German decency, didn't last long. He collapsed during his shift one afternoon and was dragged away. No one ever saw him again. James stopped asking questions. But even as the days blurred together, he couldn't stop thinking about one thing. How did the Germans allow this? He remembered the uniform, the papers, the transaction, the liaison, and it dawned on him that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was business. After Germany and Japan signed their tripartite pact, they began sharing prisoners, not out of mercy, but mutual convenience. Japan needed labor for its war industries. Germany needed resources and influence in the Pacific. Human lives became a commodity, traded, bartered, priced. James and the others were part of a secret, unofficial network, the POW trade, where captured Allied soldiers were exchanged for favors, supplies, or intelligence. They had become living currency. At night, James tried to recall home, his mother's handwriting on his last letter, the smell of rain on Yorkshire soil, but the memories started to blur, fading under layers of soot and pain. He began carving marks into a small piece of scrap metal he'd hidden behind his sleeping mat, one for every week survived. It wasn't about keeping time anymore, it was about defiance, proof that he still existed. Sometimes he'd hear rumors among the guards, whispers of an upcoming inspection by foreign allies. Each time the prisoners would be washed, beaten less, and made to stand straight for hours. Then the visitors would arrive, German officers, clean-shaven and proper. They'd nod, take notes, and leave without a word. James would stare at them with hollow eyes, silently begging for recognition, for some sign of mercy. But the officers never looked at the prisoners directly. They were there for paperwork, not people. That was the moment he understood something deeper than betrayal. Cruelty didn't always come from hatred. Sometimes it came from indifference, from men who could justify anything if it fit on a ledger. Winter hit harder than anyone expected. The camp wasn't built for cold, and the rations didn't change. Men froze in their sleep, too weak to shiver. James found himself sharing what little food he had with Thomas Quinn, a former engineer from Manchester who'd been captured in Malaya. Thomas kept talking about the world outside, how the Allies were fighting back, how one day they'd march into Tokyo and make things right. James wanted to believe him, but after months of endless labor and silence, hope was starting to sound like a luxury. Then one morning, the guards rushed them out of the barracks, shouting orders louder than usual. Trucks were arriving. The company was expanding operations, they said. The prisoners were being relocated again. James's heart sank. He remembered the first relocation. This time, there were no German intermediaries, no paperwork, just soldiers with bayonets and an empty road leading into the mountains. As they marched, the sun rose over the smokestacks, painting the sky in red and black. James looked back at the factory one last time. The place that had consumed so many lives, now just another shadow on the landscape of war. He didn't know it yet, but this new camp would make the last one look merciful. The trade had only just begun. The road into the mountains was endless. Each step sank into mud, every breath stung with cold. The guards shouted for them to move faster, but the men's bodies were beyond obedience. Their legs trembled from malnutrition, their backs raw from lashes. After 3 days of marching, they reached a desolate valley surrounded by snow-tipped peaks. There, half buried in mist, stood a collection of low wooden huts and tall chimneys. Smoke poured from the furnaces, the air smelled of coal and iron. This was Omuta Camp Number 17, one of Japan's most notorious labor complexes. Though the men didn't know the name then, all they saw were fences, watchtowers, and the rising columns of smoke that told them they'd left one hell only to enter another. The guards called it reassignment. The prisoners called it what it was, another sentence. The camp was run not by soldiers, but by the Mitsui Mining Corporation, which used Allied prisoners as disposable labor. Each man was assigned a number, a job, and a quota. Failed to meet it, and punishment followed swiftly. James was assigned to the coal mines. The descent underground was like entering the throat of a monster. The tunnels were narrow, barely wide enough for 2 men to pass. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from oil lamps that flickered weakly against the black walls. Every morning, James and Thomas would crawl down into the shafts with pickaxes and baskets, chipping at the rock for 12 hours straight. The only sound was the echo of metal striking stone, and sometimes the distant cough of another man collapsing. There were no breaks, no proper meals, just a handful of rice and salted fish that had long since turned rancid. Sometimes a guard would kick over a worker's basket just to watch him scramble. It was their form of entertainment. Days blurred into weeks. The human body learned to move automatically, like machinery. Pain became background noise, constant, dull, almost meaningless. James found himself thinking less and less about home, not because he wanted to forget, but because remembering hurt too much. Every memory, his mother's face, his brother's laughter, the smell of his father's workshop, felt like a cruel reminder of a life that had slipped too far away to touch. He started talking less, even Thomas noticed. "You can't go quiet, mate," Thomas whispered one night as they huddled under a torn blanket. "That's how they win. You stop talking, stop thinking, you stop being you." James didn't answer. He stared at the rafters and listened to the winter wind scrape against the roof. He wasn't sure there was a hymn left to preserve. Da! The camp's commandant, Lieutenant Nakamura, was a man of contradictions. In public, he was brutal, his discipline carried out with mechanical precision. But sometimes, late at night, he'd walk through the barracks alone, silent, observing. Once James caught him standing near the door, watching the prisoners sleep. His expression was unreadable, not pity, not hatred, just emptiness. Rumor had it Nakamura's own brother had died in a British bombing raid in Yokohama. Maybe this was his way of avenging it. Or maybe he'd just buried his humanity beneath the same mountain of orders that crushed everyone else. Whatever the reason, mercy was not part of his vocabulary. Da! In the spring of 1943, disease swept through the camp. Dysentery, cholera, and tuberculosis spread faster than anyone could bury the dead. The guards stopped counting after a while. James watched men vanish overnight, strong, stubborn men reduced to bones and silence. Thomas was among those who caught the fever. For days he lay in the corner of the barracks, shivering uncontrollably, his eyes glassy and distant. James tried everything he could, traded his rations for clean water, bribed a guard with a button from his old uniform for a scrap of medicine. But it was useless. On the 5th night, Thomas gripped James's wrist weakly. "If you ever get out," he whispered, "tell them what they did here. Tell them we didn't just disappear." James promised. Then Thomas stopped breathing. There was no funeral, no prayers, just another body dragged away before dawn. But something inside James shifted that day. A quiet, burning determination. Survival wasn't just about staying alive anymore. It was about remembering, bearing witness. He began to carve again, not just marks for days survived, but initials, small details, fragments of faces, a private record of a world that the war was trying to erase. Da! Months later, a small group of new prisoners arrived, captured American airmen shot down over the Pacific. Among them was Lieutenant Robert Keller, a wiry, sharp-eyed pilot who refused to bend. From the moment he arrived, Keller became a spark in the darkness. He refused to bow to the guards, refused to speak Japanese, refused to surrender his dignity. The others admired him, even when it earned him beatings. One night, Keller leaned toward James and whispered, "They think we're broken, but as long as one of us keeps standing, they'll never win." It sounded like bravado at first, but slowly it became a kind of quiet gospel in the camp. Men began to share stories again, fragments of home, of laughter, of food they could barely remember the taste of. It was rebellion in its smallest, most human form. Da! Then one morning in late 1944, something extraordinary happened. A Japanese engineer, Takahiro, came down to the mine with an interpreter. He wasn't a guard, just a company technician inspecting machinery. Unlike the others, he didn't carry a rifle or bark orders. When one of the prisoners collapsed in front of him, Takahiro knelt down and helped him up. The guards yelled at him, but he ignored them. That moment, so brief, so small, spread through the camp like wildfire. Later that night, Takahiro snuck into the barracks with a bundle of cloth. Inside were bandages and a few stolen sweet potatoes. He said nothing, just placed them on the floor and left. James didn't know why he did it. Maybe guilt, maybe compassion, maybe both. But it reminded them that even in this pit, not every heart had gone cold. Da! As 1945 approached, the sound of war began to change. Distant explosions echoed across the horizon. The guards looked nervous. Supply trucks came less frequently. Whispers spread. The Allies were advancing. The Americans had taken the Philippines. The British were moving through Burma. Japan was losing. But with that hope came danger. Desperate regimes commit desperate acts. Nakamura became increasingly paranoid. Punishments grew harsher. Any sign of rebellion, even a whisper, meant public execution. One afternoon, Keller was caught hoarding scraps of paper, crude maps of the area he'd been sketching. The guards dragged him to the yard, tied him to a post and beat him until his body stopped moving. They left him there overnight as a warning. The next morning, James walked past his friend's lifeless body, his throat tight with rage and helplessness. He wanted to scream, to strike back, to make someone pay, but he couldn't. So he did the only thing he could. He added Keller's initials to his secret carvings. A silent promise that someone somewhere would remember. Da! By summer, everything began to unravel. Allied bombers flew overhead daily, their engines rumbling like judgment. The guards became erratic, shouting at shadows, drinking heavily. One evening, a tremor shook the valley, the kind that made the earth groan. The prisoners rushed outside, fearing a cave-in, but what they saw made their hearts stop. Far to the east, a faint orange glow lit the horizon, a light unlike anything they'd ever seen. They didn't know it then, but it was the atomic fire of Nagasaki, only miles away. For hours, they watched the strange cloud rise into the sky, silent and terrible. The guards stared too, speechless. The air seemed to change, heavy, electric, final. Something in the world had ended. The next morning, the commandant didn't appear. The guards stopped shouting. By noon, they were gone, vanished into the mountains, abandoning their posts. For the first time in years, the gates stood open. No orders, no beatings, just silence. James stood at the edge of the compound, staring through the barbed wire, unsure whether to believe it. Freedom had always felt like a dream, and now that it was real, it felt almost unreal. Behind him, the camp was eerily still, men too weak to move, too stunned to understand. He took one step forward, then another. The ground beneath his feet felt different, not softer, but alive. For the first time in 3 years, he walked without permission. Da! He didn't know what waited beyond the valley, whether rescue or ruin. But he knew one thing for certain. The world would never truly understand what had happened there unless someone told it. And James Hensley intended to survive long enough to do just that. The valley was silent except for the wind. The guards were gone, the gates swung open, and yet no one moved for a long time. Freedom, after so much captivity, felt suspicious, like another trick waiting to snap shut. James stood at the entrance, staring out at the mist-covered trail. His body trembled, not from fear, but from disbelief. Behind him, men began to whisper, uncertain, hesitant, and then one voice broke through, "We're free, lads." The words didn't sound real until they echoed off the mountains. Slowly, painfully, they started walking. Some limped, some crawled, a few were carried on makeshift stretchers. They followed the dirt road down into the valley, leaving behind the fences that had defined their world for 3 years. They didn't know where they were going, only that anywhere else was better than where they had been. For 2 days they wandered through villages, scavenging food, drinking from streams. The Japanese civilians watched them in silence, wary, defeated, their own world collapsing. No one tried to stop them. On the third day, they saw it, the white star on the wing of a low-flying aircraft, an American reconnaissance plane. It circled once, dipped its wings, then disappeared beyond the ridge. Hours later, the sound of engines filled the sky. Paratroopers descended through the clouds, American and Australian soldiers with medical kits and chocolate bars. When they reached the emaciated group of men, they didn't speak at first. Some of them just stood there, staring in shock at what was left of the prisoners. James tried to salute, but his arm wouldn't lift. The medic caught him before he fell. "Easy, mate," the man said softly. "You're going home." Home. The word hit harder than any blow he'd taken in captivity. Da. In the weeks that followed, the survivors were airlifted to recovery hospitals, thin, hollow-eyed, but alive. They were deloused, fed carefully, and asked to recount their experiences. But when James tried to explain that they'd been sold, traded between Germany and Japan like property, the officers frowned. "There's no record of that," one major said, flipping through his notes. "You must be mistaken. The Germans didn't handle prisoners in the Pacific theater." James stared at him in disbelief. "Then how do you explain the German officer, the papers, the sale?" The major sighed. "War is chaos. You probably saw collaborators or interpreters. Rest, Corporal, you've done enough." That was the first time James realized his story might never be believed. The bureaucracy of victory had no room for impossible truths. The Allies wanted clean narratives, brave men, liberated by good armies, not a tale of soldiers betrayed by treaties and traded like supplies. Da. By the time James reached England, autumn had settled over the country. The docks of Southampton were crowded with returnees, their faces pale and distant. Families waited with signs and flowers, cheering when each ship arrived. James stepped onto the pier, expecting the same, but no one was there for him. His parents had died during the Blitz. His younger brother was still serving in France. The crowd moved around him like a tide, and for the first time he realized he had survived a war only to come home to silence. He was taken to a rehabilitation center outside Birmingham. Clean beds, warm food, quiet halls. But the quiet was worse than the noise of the camps. It left space for memory. Every night he woke drenched in sweat, hearing the clang of pickaxes, the hiss of molten metal, Keller's voice telling him to keep standing. He'd look at his hands, scarred, shaking, and wonder how they still belonged to him. Doctors called it battle fatigue. They gave him pills and told him to forget. But forgetting wasn't healing. It was erasure. Da. Months turned into years. The world moved on. The Nuremberg trials made headlines and the Tokyo Tribunal followed. Yet when testimony about forced labor emerged, it focused on Japanese brutality, not the shadow deals between Axis partners. The Germans denied any involvement in POW transfers outside Europe. The paper trails had been destroyed. And so the story of the men who had been traded, who had crossed continents as human cargo, vanished into the margins of history. James built a quiet life in Leeds. He married a nurse named Evelyn who'd cared for him during rehabilitation. She never asked for details and he never offered them. They had 2 children, and for a while normal life almost felt possible. But sometimes when he heard the whistle of a train or the clang of factory metal, the memories would return, sudden, sharp, unbearable. He'd have to step outside, breathe cold air, and remind himself he wasn't in Japan anymore. He tried to write about it once, a long letter to the War Office, detailing everything from the sale in Singapore to the mines in Omuta. He never got a reply. Eventually, he stopped trying. Da. In 1972, 3 decades after the war, a journalist named Margaret Linton came across a declassified British intelligence file marked POW transfers, unverified Axis activity. Inside were fragments of reports mentioning British prisoners sighted in Japanese industrial compounds, German intermediary activity, and one curious phrase, exchange and trade agreements between regional commands. Linton tracked down surviving POWs and found James living quietly in Yorkshire. When she arrived at his doorstep, he almost closed the door, but when she mentioned the word trade, he froze. He invited her in. They talked for hours. James spoke slowly, haltingly, but when he began describing the ledger with names and prices, his hands shook the way they had that day on the docks. Linton published her article a year later under the headline, "The POWs Who Were Sold, Britain's Forgotten Men of the Pacific." It caused a brief stir, questions in Parliament, a few newspaper debates, but the official response was muted. The government called it unsubstantiated and urged the public not to diminish the sacrifices of all who served. History prefers clean stories. This one was messy. But for James, it didn't matter. Someone had finally listened. Someone had written it down. In his later years, he began receiving letters from families of other POWs, from historians, from strangers who had read Linton's work and wanted to know more. Some called him a liar, others called him a hero. He didn't see himself as either, just a witness who refused to let silence finish what war had started. On quiet mornings, he would sit in his garden, holding the small scrap of metal he'd carved on in the camp, still faintly marked with initials and tally lines. Each mark was a memory, each letter a life. Sometimes his grandson would sit beside him and ask about the war, and James would smile softly and say, it wasn't just a war of armies, it was a war of people and what they were worth. The boy didn't understand then. Maybe he wasn't meant to. James Hensley died in 1984, quietly, in his sleep. His story might have faded again, if not for one final twist. In 1999, an archivist in Berlin uncovered a shipment manifest from 1942, a correspondence between a German intelligence officer and Japanese industrial agents. The document listed shipment of 300 British POWs via Singapore per industrial cooperation agreement. Among the names was Corporal J. Hensley. The discovery made headlines for a week before the world moved on again, but for those who had survived or who carried the memories of those who hadn't, it meant something profound. Proof. Proof that their suffering had not been imagined. Proof that history, though slow, had finally caught up with the truth. Today, the valley where a Muta camp once stood is quiet. The mines are sealed. A small plaque stands near the entrance, simple, almost unnoticeable. It reads, in memory of the Allied prisoners who labored and died here, far from home, forgotten by history but not by those who remember. Every year, a few visitors leave flowers there. Some are tourists, some are scholars, and sometimes one or two are grandchildren of the men who never came home. They stand in silence, feeling the cold wind against their faces, the same wind that once carried the ashes of furnaces and the whispers of men who refused to disappear. The world may forget the transactions that turned soldiers into currency, the documents may crumble, the witnesses may fade. But somewhere in that valley, in the soil, in the rusted rails, in the echo of footsteps, their story still breathes. Because stories like theirs never truly end. They linger, waiting to be told again, reminding us that even in the darkest corners of history, humanity can survive the price it was once forced to bear.